Let's talk a little bit about where to buy your spices and how to store your spices. I think this is one of the most tricky things for people because we do not know what to do with them. And it's taken me years to come up with a system that I like, which might be different than the system that you like. So, where to buy spices? Generally, there's a few specific places you can buy spices. The first that a lot of people think of is your grocery store, your local grocery store, whatever store that is. So, grocery store spices can range very much in price and in quality. And so sometimes they don't have a lot of high turnover. If you're in a pinch, if you only need a small amount of something, it's not something you use much, you might find the grocery store is a reasonable place to buy a spice that's shelf stable. However, you might find that your quote ethnic grocery stores are better places to buy certain spices. There's a lot of different grocery stores out there that serve different types of food populations, and you kind of need to know which spices to get at which places. So for us, where I live, we have grocery stores that are more around East Asian, Chinese, Korean, Thai, and so on grocery stores. And those are great to get a lot of the spices that are used more frequently in East Asian cuisine. And you can even get paste of spices, frozen spices. You can get all sorts of different kinds of things, and they are massively affordable, and you can get really big containers of them if you like. And then we actually have grocery stores that are more Central and Southern Asian, Indian, Sri Lankan, so on. And so those places are great to get more like turmeric and dried ginger and things like that you can find. And they, again, can be incredibly affordable. And because the population who is shopping at those grocery stores knows the difference between not good quality spices and good quality spices, then you can definitely usually get some pretty decent spices. The turnover tends to be really high. I promise if you go to our local Indian grocery and you buy turmeric, there's going to be a lot higher turnover there than if I go to my local conventional grocery store. And I'm going to bet that a little bottle of turmeric at the grocery store is more expensive than a big bag of turmeric at the Indian grocery. So that's something to consider when you're looking at that. Now, generally, these spices are not organic. They may not be fair trade. You don't really get a lot of information around quality, around heavy metals, around things like that. So if you want to use whatever spices are affordable and accessible for you, that is fantastic. You should use those spices. If you want to buy spices that are organic, that you know exactly the source that they're coming from, and that have been screened for metals and so on, you may want to look also at online retailers. There's a lot of retailers out there like Penzeys and Mountain Rose and Frontier and so on, and they all have access to fantastic spices. Some of them can be really affordable in larger quantities, and that's something to consider, which spices you buy a lot of, which spices you buy a little bit of. And then, there's also herb stores, and herb stores can be fun because sometimes you can get really small quantities of spices if you're not going to use them a lot, because they don't last forever. And I think one of my favorite gifts to give to people at times is to refresh their spice jars. I used to go through my grandmother's spice jars. My grandmother's English, and she really just doesn't use any spices like ever. And I remember there were spices that were literally 50 years old in her spice cabinet. I mean, it was amazing. They have little price tags that say like 17 cents on them and things like that. So, spices don't last forever. And that brings us to how to store your spices. So if you want to store the spices that you are buying in a really useful way, then the best way to store them is away from heat and away from light and away from air. So those are what you're looking for. Putting them in super pretty jars like on your stove or out on display is actually really not a great way to store them. I think spice racks in that way have gone a little bit out of fashion, but it used to be, kind of line them up above the stove or something where, all this heat and light and everything is right there. I personally find that glass jars, although I'd love to use glass jars for spices, they're never the right size. I always have extra. Like, it's just never going to work for me because I'm using quite a bit of spices and I'm buying them not in glass jars. So the way I store my spices is I keep them in the pouches that they come in. I buy them from a lot of different online retailers, or I put them in high quality sealable pouches or in smaller jars. So I'm saying this all about jars, but actually like the little jars work out really well for me. And then I'll also use some of the harder, sealable bags. I can grab some of those for you and you can check them out. Just a minute. So here's some examples of how I store spices. For things that I don't need a lot of, these are ground cloves. I find little jars like this are great. I buy spices often in these little jars. Cloves are really hard to grind, but I don't use a ton of ground cloves in my cooking. So I might buy just this little, this is like 1.2 ounces of cloves. So I'll buy something like that. For other spices that I use more of, I'll buy them in these larger bags. So this is a 4-ounce bag. Sometimes I will get them even in a pound or something like that. And this is how I store them, actually, in pouches. So I store them in the pouches in some light-proof boxes. So I have a series of, they're like little canvas boxes, and something you might store like photos in. That's a good example. And I have them alphabetized. So I have like an A box and a B box. And then have you ever seen how many C spices there are? So then I have multiple C boxes. I have one that's just chilies and all the chili associated things. And then I have another one that's a C. And then I go down the alphabet. And so I don't have 26 boxes. Like, I think when you get into the JKLMNOP, I've got all of those in one box. And so I keep that, and I keep a label of which letters are in each one of those boxes. And that's how I keep my spices. So you can find out what works for you, but you don't need to take them out of these pouches. These pouches actually seal in really well. They're good quality, and you can keep them in something like this. And you can also use all different other reusable items that you have in your house, like jars and so on. The storage can just start to get really intense. So those are a few ideas about how you might want to store some of your spices.